Since we have been talking about the ancient civilizations and how ancient civilizations existed on this planetary dimensions, the question how and how they existed, these are two separate cogs in the wheel, but both of them they are interlaced with each other. Yes, the existence itself has one section. Something exists or something doesn't. It existed, that is a statement based on some factual data that we have through the archaeological discoveries. The other section, the other part, that column talks about how did they exist? What in what capacity they existed. According to the ancient texts, especially the biblical narrative, because the only historical book that we have which encompasses the historical civilizational data is the Bible. I'm not talking about religion here. It's got nothing to do with religion. I'm talking about in academia, if you need to find things around any subject, you need to make sure that there is any form of documented data. You have to put that into consideration. And then you bring it to tests. That's what science is. Science is a tool to test the existence or the non existence of something. But when we say non existence doesn't mean that something can come out of nothing. That's a theological notion. And we are not going to be discussing on the theological aspect of this. I'm talking purely from the physical perspective, such as if something exists or if something doesn't exist. If something exists in the binary world, it's the number one. If something doesn't exist, it's the number zero. So zeros and ones that create a system, and that system, that zeros and ones, the binary system, then creates the ASCII code, and the ASCII code can be developed into graphics that we interact with on our phones. And the reason I'm interacting with you is because of the zeros and ones, the non existence and the existence. Now, going back to the point, the two sections. Section number one, if the civilization existed, yes, they did. We have the data, pyramids, ancient artifacts, cathedrals, castles. Then the other one is how did they exist? Now, this is where it gets interesting. We, as the modern day civilization with plastic as our biggest achievement, think that we are the most advanced species to walk on this dimension. Sadly, we are not. If you dive deep into the ancient lores and then you connect the dots and then you literally take your scientific tools to go and search for them, you will find that pyramids they exist across continents, and the sunken artifacts such as the the one near the coast of South India or the one in Mediterranean. Biggest examples. These two civilizations they just got destroyed within a fraction of a second based on the evidence so far. I don't know how long that millisecond or second lasted because we were not there, but because of the data and the tools and the scientific methods, such as the recreation through the algorithms, the entire structure was recreated by the computer algorithm based on the facts we have found and the patterns that we know using mathematics and physics and chemistry and biochemistry. We know that these civilizations were hyper advanced. Hence, we never managed to create something as profound as a small pyramid, let alone the entire cities. For example, the Hanging Gardens of the Babylon. That's another mystery that we can explore in future in details. I've done some work on it. I would like to share that with you, and we'll do that in future soon. But the existence and the non-existence part that I wanted to share. So this planetary dimension of ours has a limited access and entry points now. Back in the days when these civilizations that we are talking about, let's say, let's give it a name, 2 to 4 thousand years ago in the past, as a rough estimate, guesstimate, not our um, eon years, but the years that we can comprehend in our limited understanding. Those years. So the entire planetary dimension existed in a form that if we look at it now, or if someone from today travels back into the past and be able to see or observe the system that was in place on this planetary dimension, you will not be able to comprehend your own self. It's a big undertaking. How? That's another lengthy debate. But just to give you a taster, that the dimension was open, but at the same time, the portals, the access to other dimensions were widely open. You probably heard of a term called Hyperborea. That's a civilization that came from beyond the ice wall. Not the ice wall like the whole system with flat earthers are in discussion these days in the media sphere. These civilizations, they had portals, dimensions, interdimensional portals were opened 24/7. There were some instances where certain individuals or the groups managed to travel in between the dimensions, portals, or a wormhole. There were a lot of portals, a lot of dimension doors were opened. Whatever that was happening on the other side, it was visible from this side, and whatever that was happening on here, it was visible from the other side. A lot of that information is present in the form of visual depictions in the temples and the churches, and also some of the folklore. It's a preservation mechanism created, ordained by human beings, and sustained by human beings. And the stories were transferred, transmutated, and transmitted through the voice. The audio version became folklore that we call as the campfire stories in our modern day lingo. So the concept of these civilization existing in a way on this planetary dimension is where the doors to the other dimensions were open, other planes, human beings from this side can travel to the other, and whatever kind of creatures, beings living on the other side can travel back on here. A type of that creation, in Arabic, they're known as hin, bin. They existed prior to this, the main flood, the great deluge, but the DNA survived. Some of the DNA, or the DNA preservation, was done through either DNA harvesting or some other biochemical um, practices. Another subject to discuss. The classical scholars, they say Hin and Bin were destroyed prior to the human beings coming on this planet. A form of that is dinosaurs. But modern day, I think, personally, looking at the data and research, a type of Hin and Bin were destroyed, but some of them, they had the power to travel beyond the dimensions. And us human beings, as a species, we also had the power to travel in between the dimensions, like the previous civilizations, including the dinosaurs. Because dinosaurs, the way they depict in the movies and the cartoons, it's not the exact same way as the dinosaurs existed according to the historical data. But that's beside the point. They had dinosaurs, some of them like T Rex and raptors, they had developed a form of intellect. And if they were left on their own actions, they would have done much more damage to the planet, this planetary dimension in itself. So keep that in mind. This is a formula that when a civilization based on the species reaches certain levels, that civilization becomes violent, and that can cause a lot of harm to the native rest of the species. And that's what happened prior to the Great Flood. Flood came, another story, flood came. Some of the DNA of the previous civilizations, like the Hin and Bin, I mentioned, or the dinosaurs, or a form of dinosaurs, and other humanoids. Then came human beings. And then within human beings, there were few branches. And within them, you have the Shakas, the Gibborium, the Nephilims, the giants, and these were genetically modified humanoids from the human beings. Their DNA was corrupted at a molecular and subatomic levels. So they had a different kind of understanding of living on this universe and how to perform certain tasks. That's why certain prophets, according to the biblical and the Quranic data, and also the Bhagavad Gita, it was much harder to preach to them because they lacked the fundamental understanding.